Chris, thank you so much for joining us today. Now that the tax credit bill for private education costs has passed, what is on your education priority list?
Yeah, there's a lot on the list, and we were just talking before about how we don't know exactly when the legislative session is going to end, so we could probably keep adding to this list if we wanted to. But I think the most important part is bringing some transparency to public school budgets. We did a poll late last year, at the end of last year, asking voters if they would support what we call a Public School Transparency Act. And what we mean by that is the ability for citizens to be able to go and see how their school districts are spending money, where the money's coming from, how much resources do they have, what their teacher to student ratios are, what the administrator to student ratios are. That way everyone has a good idea based on this document what their school districts are facing and if they have enough money or perhaps maybe they don't have enough money. If you've ever tried to read a school district budget, it's like trying to read a different language. It is very, very difficult. In our analysis, we went through all of the school district budgets throughout the state. There are about 5 or 6 different formats that districts use. Some of them are maybe 20, 30 pages long. Some of them are 500 pages long. So we would really like to see a bill passed that requires all school districts on page 1 of the budget to have the same information. And then that way, if you're as a citizen trying to decide whether you want to perhaps buy a house in Napa or Coeur d'Alene or Idaho Falls, you can go look at that and say, okay, I can compare and contrast what my district has, what this district has, how much money is getting to the classroom, how many teachers are in that district, and so on. And we really think it's just a really good, transparent way to bring about some confidence in the public school system.
And just to clarify, this is all public information. It's just a matter of collating it and putting it in the same place in the same format.
Yep.
Short of legislation to do this very thing, Mountain States Policy Institute has put together a Transparent Schools project.
Yeah, exactly. And what we tried to do is say, look, until the legislature does this, we'll just produce it on our own. We'd like to see all the school districts do it, and some have said that they'd be very willing to do it. As you mentioned, they already have the information. It's all there. It's just a matter of knowing where to look. And if you're a busy mom or dad, you don't necessarily know where to look. But the school districts know where to look. They have the information. So it would be really easy for a school district to do. But in lieu of that happening, what we've done is we've put together the study that we're going to be releasing here in the next week or so that will show what it could look like. Now, the legislature may not pass a bill that makes it look like a carbon copy, but we're hopeful that this gives citizens and legislators an idea of what we're talking about when we say create a transparency index. And Idaho, by the way, would be the first state in the country to do this. Again, every state is different. Every state is going to do public school transparency different, but in terms of having one standardized form on the front of every budget throughout the state, Idaho would be the first.
And we, just for transparency, we did get an advanced copy of the report that you are putting out. And I love data. I love spreadsheets. And you and I both.
A lot of spreadsheets in that.
Lots of spreadsheets. I love me some Excel. At the same time, data doesn't always tell the full story, especially with some of these districts that are wildly different from even their neighboring districts. Some of them are very small and rural, and some of them are large and might have dozens of elementary schools. And so when we're looking at things like reading proficiency scores or chronic absenteeism, does the data really tell the full story as to why some of those scores, where there are districts with a high percentage of English as second language learners or high or different socioeconomic issues than a neighboring district, is that data by itself enough?
It's a great question, and I don't know the answer to that. Obviously, we would like to see more data, as much data as possible to be out in the public. And then the public is in charge of being educated and making their own determination in terms of what their school district has or how they're spending those funds. I think there are some numbers in here that surprised us as well. I mean, you mentioned some of the smaller school districts. Look, smaller school districts still have to have bus drivers and cafeteria workers and all those different folks who work outside of the classroom. And smaller school districts may have more resources per student than a larger school district would have. Does that necessarily mean they're a rich school district? No, I mean, that's not what that is saying. I think the most interesting data point, Melissa, that was in the report that we put together is the teacher to student ratios the student to administrator ratios, and then the percentage of district employees who are teachers. Those are the three numbers that I think caught me by surprise. In most school districts in our state, fewer than half of the total FTEs in the district are teachers.
So full-time employees.
Exactly,
right.
exactly. And I think a lot of people would be surprised by that. But again, that goes back to some of the requirements that we put on school districts to provide transportation and lunch and do all these things outside of the classroom. So to your point, I think there's much more information that can be available. We put together a study that's about 130 pages long. Perhaps next year we'll do 200 pages.
You brought up regulations, and that's such a big topic both in Idaho and the federal level, especially as President Trump is talking about dismantling the Department of Education.
Right.
Of course, some of those requirements that you brought up come from the federal level.
Yep.
There are a lot of families that do depend on things like school lunch and transportation. So at what point, who decides this regulation that we transport children to school and feed them lunch is too onerous, or that we provide services for children with disabilities versus, you know what, this is costing a lot of money and maybe only benefiting a small percentage of students? Who makes that call?
Yeah, I think the community makes the call. I think the state lawmakers make that call. And look, I don't think anyone is suggesting that we stop providing those things. I think in terms of the discussion that we're having about the federal role in education, it's really a matter of whether the federal government can do it better or the states could do it better. And what we've recommended is, look, get rid of the Federal Department of Education and then use that money to block grant it back to the states. And then the states will still have the funds coming in, but they don't have to worry about the overhead of the Federal Department of Education. And then our local state officials, our superintendent of public instruction, our folks who works in the state Department of Education, they can decide how those monies are filtered down to the public school districts. So I think there's misconception out there that says that if we get rid of the Department of Education at the federal level, that somehow all of that funding is going to disappear. What we would say is that let's get rid of the bureaucracy and get that funding going directly to the states.
Is there a role for bureaucracy to make sure that students with disabilities don't fall between the cracks and that even the most rural of school districts are serving the needs of those students?
Absolutely. I would say absolutely. I mean, look, what we favor at Mountain States Policy Center is a safety net. I mean, the safety net has to be there no matter what program that we're talking about. And look, I'm the father of a special needs child, so this is very near and dear to my heart. And when we were talking about the tax credit that's just been passed and other expansions of education choice, part of the reason we talk about those things is specifically to help those kids. Because look, if you're just the average kid, 90%, 95% of Idahoans like their public school, they want to keep their public school, they like Mr. Smith or Mr. Johnson, or maybe they graduated from that school and they think it's doing a great job, and that's terrific. What we're talking about, and what you've hit on, Melissa, is that remaining 5 to 10% who don't necessarily fit into the public school box. And so to the extent that we have programs to cover those students, we think that those are critical components of basically a functioning society.
Chris Cargill, President of Mountain States Policy Center, thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure.